Hi all. So as I announced online, the camera share portion of the video I posted previously didn't actually transfer, so I'm going to re-record two sections of that video so that you can actually see what I was drawing while I was talking during the video. So this video is only going to cover Aristotle's third man argument, which is a criticism of Plato's forms, and Aristotle's criticism that the forms don't allow for evaluation. So let's look at the third man argument first. So this is the third man argument. Now you actually get to see my cool drawings. So basically the argument goes like this. As we know in the theory of the forms, every physical object has its own form. So let's consider a physical object, such as cherry pie. So here is a piece of cherry pie. Get all those cherries in there. Fantastic. And it's got some steam because it's nice and hot, fresh out of the oven. Now, according to Plato, in order for this object to exist as a piece of cherry pie, there has to be a corresponding form for that object. And in our case, that would be the form of a piece of cherry pie. And so this physical object exists because it is a copy of the perfect form of cherry pie. And so the perfect form of cherry pie is going to be all of the properties that something has to have in order to be cherry pie. So dessert, food, physical object, delicious, something like that. But none of the particulars of an actual piece of cherry pie. So it won't be burnt, it won't get cold, it won't be too runny, it won't be too dry. It'll just be the perfect idea or concept of cherry pie. Now, according to Plato, every physical object that exists in the realm of sense perceptions gets to be the sort of thing it is because it has a relationship to its form. It partakes in the form, or it is a copy of a form. Now, here's Aristotle's concern. Every physical object has a form and is related to its form by a relationship that Plato refers to as partaking. And so that means that between the piece of cherry pie and the form of the piece of cherry pie, there is a relationship. Now, I'm not very creative, so for lack of a better name, we'll call this relationship 1. However, for Plato, everything has a form. Physical objects like cars and cherry pies and rutabagas have forms, but also abstract things like the form of beauty exist or the form of justice. In addition, there are going to be forms for relationships. So the student-teacher relationship would have a form, the sibling relationship would have a form, the teammate relationship would have a form, and the relationship between, say, a piece of cherry pie and the form of a piece of cherry pie will also have its own form. So because this relationship, this connection is a thing, it has to have a form to explain it. So let's go ahead and add this form in. So here's a form, and for lack of a better name, because I'm not terribly creative, we will call this form number 1. Now, this form is a very particular form. It's the form of the relationship between cherry pie and the form of cherry pie. And of course, every object that exists and every subject that exists, including relationships, have their own forms, and they get to have the properties they have because they're related to their forms or partake in their forms. But since this relationship itself is a thing, and it has its own form, it needs to be connected to its own form. And so between this relationship and this form, there is another relationship, which for lack of a better name, because I'm not terribly creative, we'll call relationship 2. Now, relationship 2 is different from relationship 1. Relationship 1 is the relationship between a piece of cherry pie and the form of cherry pie. And this form is the form of the relationship between a piece of cherry pie and the form of cherry pie. This relationship, relationship 2, is a different relationship. This is the relationship between a piece of cherry pie and the form of cherry pie, and the form of the relationship between the piece of cherry pie and the form of cherry pie. So this is a relationship between relationship and form, not between physical object and form. It's a different sort of relationship. And because it's a relationship and it exists, according to Plato, it gets its own form. And for lack of a better name, we'll call this form number 2. Now, this relationship is different than this relationship. Relationship 1 is between a physical object and its form. Relationship 2 is between a relationship and its form. And this form number 2, of course, then is different than form number 1 because it's the form of a different object. Well, this is an object, a sort of, abstract object. This is its form, and between every object and its form, there is, of course, a relationship. And we'll go ahead and call this relationship number 3. Now, importantly, this relationship is different from relationship 1 and relationship 2. R1 is between pi and the form of pi. R2 is between relationship and form of relationship. R3 is between the relationship to the form of a relationship and a relationship between a physical object and the form of an object, and the form of a relationship between a relationship and a form, that's the relationship between a physical object and the form of a physical object. So because this relationship is different than either R1 or R2, it of course gets its own form, which we will call form 3. Now, clearly you can see the problem. This is a different relationship and form pair, so it generates its own form. We'll call that R4 because it's its own relationship. That's going to get its own form. We'll call that F4. And of course, that will require a relationship and a form and a relationship and a form. And you can see that my pen has limitations, but that this will continue on infinitely. Now, as mentioned in the other video, the problem here is that in order for Plato to explain the existence of one piece of cherry pie, he literally needs to posit the existence of an infinite number of relationships and an infinite number of forms. Okay, so that's the third man argument. The other argument that I want to discuss in this video, so that you can actually see what I was doing, is Aristotle's criticism that the forms don't allow for evaluation. So kind of the problem here is that the forms are the perfect versions of things, and anything that exists in the sensible realm or the physical realm is just meant to be an imperfect copy. But according to Aristotle, that means that we can't criticize objects in this reality because everything in this reality is by its very nature flawed. And so the example that you didn't get to see in the other video was my attempt to draw a circle. So let's say you asked me to draw a circle. You're like, hey Liz, we're pretty sure you're familiar with circles. Go ahead and draw us a circle. And so I sit down and I'm like, all right, fantastic. I'm gonna draw a circle. Just kind of careful. Okay, careful. Don't get nervous. This is fine. You're nailing this. And boom, perfect. Totally rocked it. Here's the problem. Clearly, there's something wrong with my circle. Clearly, if you saw this circle, you would be like, Liz, that's not a circle. That's maybe a potato chip, a ball of foil. We're not sure, but it's not a circle. Well, Aristotle's concern is that Plato doesn't leave you room to make that criticism. If you criticize my circle for not being close enough to a circle, I can easily come back and say this. The perfect circle only exists in formal reality. Nothing in physical reality will ever be perfect. All you get here are flawed, imperfect copies of formal reality. So everything in this reality is by definition flawed. So if you want to say that there's something wrong with my circle, I can come back and say, but this is a physical representation of a formal circle. No circle that anyone can possibly draw would be a perfect circle. So to point to my circle and criticize it for being imperfect is unfair because it has to be imperfect because it's here. According to Plato, perfection only relies on the formal realm. In the physical realm, you're always going to get imperfection. And so on the face of it, and I want to see what you guys have to think about this because I think there's some room to push back. On the face of it, you can't criticize my circle for being imperfect because it was destined to be imperfect because it's part of the physical realm. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and stop there. That's basically what you guys missed in the other video.